We started a bit late, so I think we probably can do 15 minutes of questions without violating norms. If you have a question, please raise a hand. There's two there. There are microphones that will come to you. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us. I was wondering, to what extent do you view social media platforms as being neutral actors or not? And if not, do you think that there should be any changes to their governance or what kind of role their CEOs could play?
This is a great question. After I'd finished The Square and the Tower, our colleague George Schultz said, well, young man, that's all very interesting, but what are you going to do about it? And so I had to write a kind of what is to be done paper on internet and network platform regulation. And so that was a big part of what I worked on over the last 18 months. And the conclusion I came to was that the status quo is not defensible for a bunch of reasons. The most obvious one being that the network platforms have this inbuilt tendency to polarize and disseminate fake news. The other is that they are both very powerful and not politically neutral. Because, as is well known, the companies are run by people to the left of center by and large, and they employ people quite far to the left of center. And so to have the most powerful media companies, which effectively they have become, so clearly politically engaged is extremely dangerous. The current regulatory setup has a kind of catch-22 quality to it. This is because of something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is mid-1990s legislation, long before these companies existed in most cases, which allows them to say, let's suppose they post something that leads to somebody getting shot or raped. That they say, well, under Section 230, we're just a network platform, and we don't vet the stuff. Sorry, but not our problem. But if they then engage in censorship and they kick people off the platform because they think that they're alt-right, and those people say, hey, what about free speech? Then they say, oh, well, we're just publishers. We have the right to do that. First Amendment doesn't apply here. So they are in this wonderful position that they're network platforms when they want to be, and they're publishers when they want to be. And it's extremely difficult to hold them to account through the courts, and most attempts to do so fail, to say nothing of the fact that they have armies of lawyers that would fill one of these auditoriums many times over. Most people, I think, today are drawn towards the idea of antitrust. Let's break them up. I think that will fail. I think it's doomed to fail. It will also take way too long. The other alternative that gets discussed is let's have regulation, let's create some kind of powerful federal authority or empower one of the existing ones more. Interestingly, Mark Zuckerberg says, oh yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, we want to be regulated. And the reason he says that is that history shows when you create powerful federal regulation, the big companies co-opt it in some way and usually benefit from it, and new entrants lose out. So we should be very skeptical about both antitrust and regulation as answers. I think you need to come at this through the courts. You need to modify or get rid of Section 230 altogether. And this is my second recommendation. There needs to be a quasi-First Amendment right of free speech on the network platforms. It should not be within the power of these most powerful companies to decide who gets free speech and who doesn't. If you're interested, the paper is online in one of the Hoover websites, and you can get all the detail there. The second question from the gentleman next to you.
Thank you for speaking to us today, sir. Shortly after President Trump's victory in 2016, you wrote an article in the Boston Globe where you talked about the possibility of Trump's foreign policy and whether he would follow a Henry Kissinger-esque foreign policy. He said that one of the recommendations would be to give a weakened, traumatized, post-imperial Russia the recognition that Vladimir Putin craves as a great power, as an equal, and not a supplicant of American-designed system. Many will say that he has done this to some effect. I'd like to know, approaching 3 years on you writing that, what are your thoughts on whether he's done this, whether that's been a successful kind of move, especially with Brexit and the weakened European system, and how that plays in foreign policy as a whole?
Thanks. Great question again. It's always worrying when people say, you wrote in 2016. God, what did I write? What's coming? But that article was part of a bigger attempt to think about the new administration's foreign policy, most of it written in the transition, late 2016. And I made the argument that there was a way in which Trump could be a kind of Theodore Roosevelt, that he could try to use the great power policies that had worked in the 19th century, particularly by using the permanent members of the UN Security Council as a kind of condominium of great powers. But that required Russia to be brought, as it were, back in from outside the tent. It also meant going with Brexit and regarding Britain rather than the EU as a counterparty, as well, of course, as France and China. It hasn't worked. The correct analysis was Graham Allison's. So Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, about the Thucydides trap, essentially predicting the escalation of US-China conflict, was correct, and I was wrong. And you have to acknowledge when you're wrong. It's extremely important. I was with Graham a lot when he was writing the book. We were both discussing these issues. I said, don't call the book Destined for War. That's way too negative. But you know what? That's the way things have played out. The dominant geopolitical consequence of Trump's election is the rise of the Sino-American antagonism, the end of what I call Chimerica. We've had a trade war, a tech war. The currency war is probably escalating even as I stand here speaking to you. And I don't see a way of dialing that back. As for Russia, you're right, that was Trump's instinct, but he's been constrained by Congress. And this illustrates the limits of presidential power. When people are telling you that Trump's a tyrant and the republic's doomed, point out that the Constitution actually still works, and the separation of powers is such that Trump cannot unilaterally say, we're going to have good relations with Russia, because if Congress is slapping on sanctions, as it has been on a regular basis, then it doesn't count for a thing. All the tweets, all the making nice to Putin is irrelevant if Congress is able to escalate the sanctions against Russia and essentially make any kind of change in the US-Russia relationship impossible. So I think he's tried, but he's failed, and it illustrates the limits of presidential power that he's failed. Thanks. I don't know who's next with the mic, because now there are lots of hands up and time is running out, so tense moments. Why don't we go there, and then we'll just kind of, why don't we take a batch of questions? Maybe that's the way to do this, because we've got limited time. So just kind of make your questions succinct, pass it, and then pass the mic along, and we'll try and get maybe 5 in, and then I'll wrap. You're on first.
Thank you, Professor Ferguson. So as a historian, but also as someone who served as an advisor to both the McCain and Romney campaigns, how do you balance your partisan views with how you read and view and understand history? Do you believe that there are methodologies to create a veil, or do you believe that actually partisanship is inherent and core part of how you study and understand history?
Thanks. Great question.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. I was interested in your critique of Snyder, and it seemed like you were drawing quite a distinction between populism and fascism as ideologies. So I'd be interested to hear if you think there are overlaps, particularly between right populism and fascism in terms of the ideology, not necessarily in terms of the effect that we're seeing. And then by extension, your thoughts on the idea of populism as this kind of thin-centered ideology, the kind of Kazmada thesis on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And third question.
What should we know about Boris Johnson and how he fits into all of this?
Yeah. I've been asking myself that question for 35 years.
I was interested in hearing the analogy to late 19th century US history, and I was wondering, other than technological change, such as with the rise of social media, what other distinctions you draw between the two times? Like, where does the analogy fall apart other than perhaps that kind of progress?
Thank you very much. And let's keep going. This is kind of going well. We're going to just keep going, and then I'm going to give one more answers. Yeah.
So a couple of thoughts are in a question form here. So
just make just one. You're only allowed one.
So what do you think of the theory of, I don't remember who coined it, but a cool war, right? So
Noah Feldman.
Okay. There you go. That's why you're up there.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So that we're inextricably economically tied, but there's inherent conflict.
Yeah.
And then you discussed the presidents, some Democratic presidents who you said who've gotten involved in wars. I mean, what do you think about the argument that, I mean, you have Woodrow Wilson, who tried to end future wars with the League of Nations. You have FDR, who, I mean, you could argue that it was Hitler who got the world into a war, and he was trying to end it. So standing up for liberal institutions or democratic institutions.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to take two more. Those two gentlemen right in the middle of that row, and I'm sorry to everybody else, but we're just going to run out of time. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for being here. My question is, do you have a theory of history?
There's a nice, easy question. That shouldn't take more than 30 seconds.
Thank you very much for your lectures. What's your thoughts on the notion that democracy in of itself always leads to populism, as exemplified by F.A. Hayek's essay "Why the Worst Rise on Top," and also just to push back on the notion that the fact that we were having that most of the voting populists would be millennials or Gen Z. I don't think that necessarily equates that there will be a higher voting turnout for these groups.
Right. Yeah. Great. All right. So we have 5 minutes to answer these questions, which should be fun. Max Weber said that when you enter the lecture hall, you should leave your politics at the door. I think one should frankly acknowledge one's political orientation as an historian, so that readers are aware of it. But when you're writing history, you should, as far as you can, and also when you're lecturing about it, as far as you can, set aside your personal preferences. And I try to do that. I'm not sure how successfully, but I certainly make it clear where I stand. And then I try to tell stories, often against my own preferences. It's not like I want Elizabeth Warren to be president. But it just seems to me that historically, that is quite a high probability scenario at this point. There, of course, are overlaps between populism and fascism, but fewer than you might think. I mean, populism was seen in any case in the late 19th century America as a left-of-center movement that ended up being absorbed by the Democrats. Whereas in Europe, the populists, because they were more overtly anti-Semitic, tended to be thought of as being on the right. That's an obvious point of transition where there were continuities from the late 19th century French and German populists to the Nazis, even some continuities of personnel. But the thing that makes Nazism so much more potent than populism is that it has this really radical foreign policy agenda, which is essentially to go to war and reverse the result of World War I. And I think the big difference in my mind between populists and fascists is uniforms. Fascists just can't resist the boots and the khaki, and populists always wear bad suits. And that's a good guide. When people say, oh, it's like the 1930s, I wish I could put you in a freaking time machine and send you back to the 1930s. And you could just spend an afternoon in Berlin in 1938. Almost all the men would be in uniform. And that's a big difference. Fascists like uniforms, parades, and even if they don't go to war, they like to sound like they're going to. And that's just not what populism is about. Populism is much more about tariffs, restrict immigration, these cosmopolitan elites. And that's a very different agenda. And populists are isolationist at heart. They really don't want to do the empire thing at all. Boris. Well, Boris is not really the outsider that Trump is. I mean, Boris went to Eton, to Oxford. We were contemporaries at Oxford. He then wrote for The Telegraph, which I also did. He then went into the Conservative Party, which I did not. And And so one needs to recognize that he's a much more establishment figure than most of the populists, from Bolsonaro to Duterte to Trump himself. On the other hand, he's playing populist cards, and he's doing it with some aplomb. And the thing about Boris, which you can't deny, is that he has succeeded in fulfilling his one sacred principle, which was that Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister. And that's really the only principle Boris has. And now the only question is, can he stay Prime Minister? It's definitely a different story, even if the blonde, tousled hair conjures up images of a British Trump. I'm going to take the last 4 questions very fast. Yeah, there are lots of differences, of course, between now and the late 19th century, but the key similarity I would emphasize is globalization. That the late 19th century was a time when capital markets, labor markets, and trade markets were almost as integrated as they've been in our time, and they generated the same things that led to the populist backlash. They generated the great movements of people, the widening inequalities, and that seems to me like the big common factor. Is that for me? Tell Ferguson to shut up. Cool War. Noah Feldman's book was ahead of its time. He wanted it to be a bestseller. It totally wasn't. And that illustrates that in the realm of public intellectuals, as Francis Fukuyama and Huntington knew, timing is everything. And I think Noah was about 3 years early with Cool War. The basic analysis is right, but nobody was really paying attention. Sure, all the great Democrats have aspired to new international orders based on some combination of international law and collective security, but only after they've involved the United States in major conflicts. Do I have a theory of history? Yes. You didn't ask me to say what it was, though. It's probably best captured in the book Virtual History, the introduction of which sets out a non-deterministic theory of history in which there's a lot of chaos and contingency, and it's extremely hard to predict the future. And finally, democracy and its discontents. I think the key lesson from Hayek is that the rule of law matters ultimately more than how elections are held or governments are chosen. And a system that doesn't have the rule of law is fundamentally different from one that does. A system with the rule of law will always toss the populists out if they fail to deliver. I think that's what the United States has. The reason that populism, and here I'll end, has longer lifespans in Latin America is that the rule of law is less secure there, and when the populists are failing, what they almost always do is change the constitution so that they can stay in power. As long as that's not a possibility, I think populism in the Northern Hemisphere has a very short half-life. Thank you all for great questions.